Turks on the sourdough.
Oh yeah, so how are you?
Good, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, doing well on this Tuesday. How are you, Robert?
Good. How are you?
Doing well this Tuesday.
Where I live, it went from being in Celsius like 15 degrees to we have had blizzard. It's been blizzarding for the last 2 days, and there's like probably like a foot of snow outside.
Really?
Yeah, it's awful.
Jeez.
It's 15 degrees here, if that helps.
It's not too cold here. It's only -3. It's just there's an immense amount of snow.
Should probably
It's
go
nice.
shovel that.
I did shovel once. It is now entirely back.
Oh my god.
It has not today's, I think it was blizzarding all night yesterday and all day yesterday and the night before. So, and before there was no snow left on the ground, and now it's like, I don't know if this is gonna be awful, but maybe.
No, I'm interested. Oh my
I
gosh.
can't see well, but it's all snow.
I can see a lot of snow.
Yeah.
It's nice here. When does it not snow?
That's a good question. I'll let you know when I figure it out. Winnipeg, where I live, is known for really extreme climates and like harsh swings. I think in Canada it has like the highest like the difference between its hottest day and its coldest day. Like some days will be over +35, and in the winter it'll be like -45 at its coldest.
35's hot. It's like 80-ish or something like that. Yeah, I've really lived in like one band. I've lived in a few places, but it's been on like a very similar. Oh God, you would think I'd know the latitude, the same like north-south like thing for that little like Amtrak region of North America or Europe. So I'm not used to that climate.
Yeah, I don't really have a good excuse other than I was born here, so this is where all my family is, and it's like that's what everyone's excuse for living here is.
Yeah, I mean, that's as good as any.
Yeah.
Were you fully remote before March of 2000 or whatever? Does Shopify have offices in Winnipeg?
Once upon a time they did actually very, very long ago, but that was way before my time. I was actually in Ottawa. I was working out of the offices there.
Oh, okay.
When they went all remote, cost of living in Ottawa is quite a bit higher than Winnipeg, so it made sense to just live where it's cheaper, where my family is.
Yeah. No, for sure. It's interesting. Yeah, it's like I feel like we're starting to get into that range the next couple months where companies are gonna be like, hey, by the way, that whole like you can do whatever you want for as long as you want. Like, guess what? We need you back next week or whatever.
It's like the offices are open and we need you in them now.
Yeah, it's we have a meeting in 5 minutes. I already paid for this real estate, please.
Shopify seems pretty committed to the remote thing, so we'll see how that all goes.
Yeah, I think you're.
Eric, this meeting is being recorded for quality and assurance purposes.
Yeah, I'm not saying anything proprietary. I'm just ragging on companies. It's fine.
On that note, it is about the usual time to kick off the quality. Yeah. So yeah,
Do it.
take a quick look at the agenda. Right now I see a lot of names going on, and then just kind of the usual plan. So if that stands, yeah. So I guess just first off, is there anything on this agenda that not on the agenda that we should at least mention up front that we should go over?
I have a few things. I have a PR in progress that you can take a look at later that is trying to implement like upgradable tracers so that the API tracer upgrades to an SDK tracer once the SDK is installed. I just opened a couple of issues right now for recent changes in our kind of custom instrumentation library, our legacy code base, that I think we should try to reflect in OpenTelemetry Ruby as well. So yeah, if we can chat about those briefly later on, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, that sounds good. I'll kick it off with the spec sig that it was not a super lengthy spec sig. Let me share a screen and let me see how this share screen goes. I have a slightly different setup today, which I'm sure will be fun. I'm sharing from like a gigantic monitor. So like how is this coming across? It's okay? Great. Zoom.
That's good. It's slightly taller than normal, but still very easy to read.
Okay. Should I do anything to it is the question. It works. Great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Short aside, last week at the meeting after this meeting, one of my cats bit through my MacBook display, which is what I used to use for my webcam. And the display went dark. I managed to make it through the meeting because I was hooked up to an external as well, but rebooting did not work. So I found myself at the Apple Store in downtown Portland, which is like a fortress. I mean, I guess it's not surprising. It's the only way to survive down there right now. But yeah, the armed guards let me in. Apple Care does cover such things. Okay, now onto the spec sig. And it's back. It's back. The turnaround time was pretty quick. All right. So I think there's this issue, and I was not here for this discussion, but I think this was brought up a little while ago that this had to do with the values. Let's actually see what the changes are. It appears as though it just normalizes the semantic conventions for resources, for a lot of the resources to be lowercase. So I don't think there's anything too controversial there.
Does that impact any of our resource detectors maybe? But then that should be.
Yeah, so
yeah, probably does.
if
Seems fine.
yeah, likely if we have
I don't think it's a big deal to fix.
Yeah, totally. So
Yeah,
like we are just thinking out loud.
so we should make sure that we adhere to these new conventions. It hasn't merged yet, but it is getting a lot of approvals, so it looks like it is on its way to merging. Thing that I was here for, and this ended up being a pretty long discussion. It is the basically, I think the ask here is wanting to be able to set status if it's not already set. So the question started to come off as, can we get like a reader on status? And there's the open telemetry design is really strongly discouraged any kind of like reading like of span data. In general, the approach has been span should be write only or almost completely write only. And the reason for this is to make it possible to have a streaming tracer where you just kind of like send off basically your whole span API just kind of like, sends messages downstream somewhere, and that's where the true state of your span actually exists. It's not really kind of held in memory in the process where the spans are being created. So anytime you put a reader on something, it complicates that whole process. So there's been a strong resistance for that sort of thing. But basically, I think there is some verbiage in the spec that instrumentation, that setting status is really something that the user is supposed to do, as at least setting status to error is something that's supposed to be reserved to the user because of complications in universally deciding what is an error. But I think this is the Java auto instrumentation group. They would like to set the status to error if something in the instrumentation is pretty uncontroversially an error, but they don't want to override like a user set status, more or less. That's kind of the whole backdrop to this. And I think ultimately, there have been a bunch of suggestions thrown around here, but yeah, so the last comment here kind of sums up. Discuss adding a status source field with two states, user and instrumentation. User status always wins. In practice, we add this feature by changing the current set status function to set the source as user to avoid breaking user code. An additional set status method or option would be added to set instrumentation as the source. So that sounds slightly complicated. Another solution would be to add an option to set status, add an end option to set status. So I believe the way that this would work is that if you call set status with this end option, it will apply the status at span end if it hasn't been set otherwise.
I think this is suggesting that end, like when you end a span, you can pass a status at that time that would only apply if the status was currently unset.
Yeah, okay. As I reread this, that actually makes a lot more sense. And would be easier to deal with. So
if I'm understanding that correctly, then is the approach we're taking with the rack tracer middleware correct then? Because we're setting the span status based off of the HTTP status that comes in.
Yeah, so that is correct. But the key problem here is that auto instrumentation, semantic conventions kind of dictate when you set an error status, and the spec says that ideally, if a user is explicitly setting the status, then that should take precedence over instrumentation setting the status, because the user has more knowledge about their use case than the instrumentation author. So, and the original approved solution for this was that you'd actually have this status source thing that would tell you, did it come from instrumentation or did it come from user? And a user setting would always take precedence. That I'm not entirely sure why that didn't make it into the spec, but it didn't. So here we are.
So does that sound like a reasonable approach? Are there any concerns with doing that for Ruby?
I think it's a reasonable approach, where generally, I think in the rack instrumentation, we're only setting the error status at the end anyway, or right before ending the span. So it's not terrible, at least for the known use cases. Are there unknown use cases where this could be a problem? I don't know.
I'm just kind of thinking out loud, whether our HTTP clients, which we have instrumentation for, do we even really have a place where a user could set the HTTP client span status? It feels, if it's under auto instrumentation outside of a processor?
Technically, no, but I mean, you could conceive of ways with Faraday middleware or something that you'd be able to set the status before the span was ended.
Yeah.
So we don't have any hooks that allow them to do that, but they're for clever use cases, I'm sure you could create middleware and hook it up at the appropriate point.
Yeah. I wonder how in practice, how well a true streaming exporter would function with some of our practical, approaches we would need to, I don't know, with instrumentation, basically, whether, I don't,
You just end up keeping the state on the back end and having to update it, right? You can't, your span can't be frozen on the back end. You need to be able to update the status and have this logic of instrumentation set status. User set status takes priority over instrumentation set status. But
yeah, it's the on the back end part that I'm thinking about.
But that's a vendor issue, right?
Yeah, it's a problem.
You got smart people there.
Anyway. Okay. Well, thanks for
reminder. This is being recorded.
Yeah. Thanks for humoring me. Cool. It might be worth thinking about as we add new instrumentation to not prioritize, but hooks are a place where we'll maybe save ourselves a lot of, if not trouble, certainly just users coming to us and saying like, "Hey, I can't do this on my back end." So hooks might save us in practice a lot of times as we move forward.
Yeah, I think in general we should not add hooks if there's an existing mechanism like Faraday middleware that people are able to leverage. So like the Faraday instrumentation probably doesn't need hooks, but for things where like users can't easily get a handle on stuff to update the span before it's ended, then we should provide ways of doing that.
Cool. Yeah, that makes sense.
I generally recommend if people want some custom statuses on things, you're in the realm of like create your own span within the context of doing a thing, and then you're doing manual instrumentation to instrument your custom error case. Not like a web request has a fairly standard nomenclature in web development world that, this web request failed with a status code, and that status code is considered an error. And if you want to reinterpret it, that's an opportunity to make a span around it. Or so I would steer my users away from trying to tinker with the state of auto instrumented events, and more around like you have an opportunity here to enrich the data that you're getting out of instrumentation by making your own event and annotating it in the way that you want and according to your business logic.
Yeah. The flip side of that is that you typically want to start with auto instrumentation, and if you get a lot of noise out of the box, and that's inconvenient. The other, and it's nice if you just have simple little hook points where you can say, no, like this is not an error for my use case. The other thing is that there's been a lot of discussion over time about like nested spans and how those are interpreted on the back end, and how it can be useful to actually collapse a lot of information into, a client span, a single client span, or a single server span. But yeah, I mean, it's a trade-off, and I don't think there's I don't think the issue has been settled in the community yet about which is better.
I think those are good and interesting ideas to bring possibly to the instrumentation working group. Yeah, as we were just discussing that, like I was kind of thinking through my mind of like, why don't we have hooks on all the instrumentation for like before span end, or after start, something like that. That would be amazing.
So there was actually a spec issue at some point, maybe, I don't think it was an OTEP, but maybe a spec issue at some point to have this before span end hook, precisely because spans are read-only once they're ended. So that becomes a more general thing. It's not just an instrumentation thing. It becomes like any span, you can trigger something before the span ends. So you get a chance to update it one last time before it's frozen.
Yeah, the one thought that occurred to me in the instrumentation context that made me that tempered my excitement a little bit was that like some instrumentation will create a single span, and it makes a lot of sense to have like a single hook. Some of them create like multiple spans, and then you end up with like, how do you represent that? And maybe there's a clean way to do it, but yeah, I think those are interesting ideas and things that we could possibly come up with some pretty good systems around. If nothing else, like there is the ability to try to find a good point in the code where you can grab at the current span and go from there, but that can be harder said than done.
Cool.
Have we covered this sufficiently? Should we move on?
Thanks for entertaining.
No problem. All right. There was an update on the API, and it sounds like stuff is moving along for the metrics API. Sorry, I think we kind of talked about this a little bit last week about like, where are things? When is the right time to start looking at stuff? I don't know that we have the answers to any of those questions, but we at least have like a status update as to where things are. So there is this document, which is new API. So this is the thing that the API working group is working on. We can take maybe a more detailed look at that, but the summary was that it currently I guess the revamp includes the meter provider, meter counter, and then counter func. So it's kind of like the synchronous and async versions of a counter. Says there are 2 remaining tasks. Decide the remaining instruments and their names. Okay, I guess that was a big question for me, why only counter and counter func, but it seems like they just wanted to get a synchronous and an asynchronous instrument in there as part of the initial design. And then reusing the hint API after they have the SDK spec. I'm not super familiar with what the hint API is. I don't know if anyone's been following that and has any light to shed.
No, it rings a bell, but I don't actually recall what it is. I'll have to look at it.
So that's the API, I guess, that they're starting to kind of firm up. So that's what the user is going to interact with. The SDK spec will start next week. So that'll be what backs the API. And then targeting an initial experimental release by the end of May. And they were saying that there would be a discussion at the Thursday meeting about some of this roadmap in future and open questions. So I'm not sure if anybody is interested in that. There is a Thursday meeting. I'm not exactly sure when it happens, but they were going to at least recap the highlights at the maintainers meeting the next Monday. So I usually go to the maintainers meeting and can bring any of that, those updates to the Ruby SIG. But yeah, that is the update. It does sound like stuff is coming along, and if you are interested, probably have a look over this document for all of the details. Any questions, comments about this? All right, so I think we have finished the spec sig. We can move on over to our repo. Francis mentioned a PR to look at and some issues to go through.
Sure.
So
this
should we look at the PR?
Yeah, sure. We don't need to go through the whole thing, but the stuff that's already been commented on is the interesting to-dos anyway. So this is, maybe actually you can click on the issue 706 and we can take a look at that because that has a little more context. So this is some of the stuff that we discussed last week. We want to be able to upgrade a tracer that's been returned from the global tracer provider, the default global tracer provider before the SDK has been installed. We'd like to upgrade it to be an SDK tracer. So I've discussed here some of the considerations. I did a survey of the other language SIGs, and some of them don't really do anything special. So Swift, C++, Rust, and .NET don't seem to do anything special. Go has a thing that delegates tracer calls once a real tracer provider. So it has this proxy tracer provider and proxy tracer instances. Python does something pretty similar. It has this one weird thing where it only allows the global tracer provider to be set once. So initially it's that the global provider is nil, and if you ask for a tracer from the nil tracer provider, you get these proxy tracers, and then it's kind of a set once thing that then does the upgrade of whatever proxy traces have been returned. JavaScript has a similar registration process to plug in the real one. I think JavaScript and Go allow you to set it multiple times, but only the first time you set it will things be upgraded. Java and Python only allow the tracer provider to be set once. Java doesn't seem to do anything special. It just tries to get SDK initialization to happen as early as possible. So anyway, I implemented the proxy tracer provider and proxy tracer approach. And then if we flip over to the PR, the things that need to be decided are, do we need to use a mutex for this? And I think so. Part of the reason is that this isn't an atomic set, really. We need to walk all the traces that have been created so far for this proxy tracer provider and set their delegate, and then set the delegate for the tracer provider, and then update the tracer provider to point to the real one. So I think we probably need a mutex here, just in case somebody's trying to set tracer provider from multiple threads. I don't know. This isn't a performance critical path anyway. And then the other open question is, should we allow only setting this global once the way that Python does? So I don't know if anybody has opinions about that. I know Robert does, and he's made his opinions, or at least he's discussed some use cases here for setting it multiple times. We kind of set it multiple times in tests anyway, because we reset it to nil. And I should also point out there's some test failures in the test that I added, but only on certain versions of the VM. So this will be a fun one to track down.
I was just going to at least mention, yeah, I made this comment about like whatever we do for tracer provider, we should do for the other globals. I retract part of that after this conversation now, just because I think the adder writers will be atomic and do not need to be protected by a mutex.
Yeah, and the trace config is, I'm just drawing a blank on the term right now, but it's basically a const object. So it's a read-only thing. When you create the config, so if you want to adjust the config, you need to create a complete new config and then insert it, and the insertion is going to be atomic. And then the other one people were talking about was the span processor. You can only add span processors at the moment. You can't swap out the span processor for a different one. And I believe that is protected by a mutex, but I'll have to double check that. And then there was one other one, the ID generator for span IDs and trace IDs. Yeah, that's not protected by a mutex, but that's just an adder writer anyway.
Yeah, I guess the spirit of my comment here anyways was mainly whatever policy we decide around the global should I think we're kind of committed to supporting once we decide it. So if registering these are all expect it to be thread safe, then we kind of commit to it, whatever happens in the future, and whatever that means. And
yeah, in general, we've tried to be thread safe, so we should continue doing that because we know this is going to be executed in a multi-threaded context. It's questionable about whether this specific operation would be, but we might as well be careful, I think, around this.
yeah, I think as long as we don't end up having to introduce locking that's going to create perf issues as a result, because I feel like
this is not on a critical path, so it's okay.
Yeah, I think those were the things that were on my mind, but it seems like we are happy with this, that we can make this thread safe without introducing any perf issues. So why not?
Right. Does anybody have opinions about only allowing this to be set once? There is a weird thing that we do in tests where we set it to nil. So you have this behavior where you haven't set it. So if you ask for the tracer provider, you get the proxy tracer provider, and it returns proxy traces. And then if you set it, all those proxy traces are going to be upgraded, or they're going to have their delegates set to real tracer instances. And then we hammer it to nil again after the test. So the next call is going to create a new proxy tracer provider, right? Which happens to be what we want in tests. But is this the correct behavior at runtime? Would anybody realistically trigger this behavior at runtime? Do we care?
I'm less concerned with like runtime, because I think you're probably doing something kind of weird if you run into this in like your production environment. But I could see this could be kind of frustrating in test. Like something I was working on yesterday, there's an application, and for 99% of their tests, they don't care that tracing exists in the background, and rightfully so. It just kind of goes off to no producer or exporter, I should say. But there's like 2 or 3 files that they've added explicit trace points, and they want to test the resulting span. So in that case, like you probably wouldn't want to use, say, like what we do in our test, we use the in-memory exporter, and then we could look at our spans. They probably don't want to do that for their entire test suite, or making the assumption that they don't want to. So being able to configure the SDK once with a no-op exporter, and then again, maybe in that select test with the in-memory one, so you can actually look at the result and then turn it off again after, like that kind of workflow, I think we should have some support. Now, whether or not that means, like, kind of left this in the comment, like whether or not that means like we say, yeah, you can only allow setting it once, but we make some gnarly test helper package that digs into instance variables and allows you to do whatever you want, but we create some sort of clean API to do it. That's, you use this in test sort of thing.
Yeah, it would actually be safe and would probably behave correctly, like would behave the way people think it would behave if you allowed it to be set multiple times. The weirdness is if you hammer it to nil the way we do, because we're explicitly testing this behavior. But yeah, if you're hammering it to nil in your test suite instead of hammering it to a no-op tracer provider, which you can do, then it could be problematic, because then you're going to potentially get the thing upgraded multiple times, and you might get what you think are no-op traces suddenly behaving like real traces.
And
I was gonna say, like, one way to do that is, I don't know, maybe figuring out a way to steer people away from using global tracers as part of their test cases, because we're, for example, using dependency injection. If you have a class that relies on a tracer, you can provide it a configured tracer just for that test case, and decouple yourself from the global tracer. That's one way to do that. The question about whether or not overriding that global tracer provider multiple times, what kind of problems I myself? Probably confusion, but if somebody is overriding the global tracer multiple times, that's probably a bug in their code, and they'll still have to try to figure that out if we prevent them from overriding it. Like, what would we do? Would we raise an exception to say you can't set this again, or would we log an error and they'd still have to try to track it down? Like, what would we do to give them feedback that they can't set that tracer multiple times? Either way.
Yeah, the alternative may be just to say you can't set it to nil.
Oh, so is the question of like resetting the tracer to nothing? That's the contentious point.
That's a contentious point. Yeah. Like, we're doing that in our tests because that's a convenient way to test the upgrade behavior. But it's not something end users should do. End users should maybe set it to a no-op tracer provider, or simply not reset it or something, right? Read the old tracer provider and hammer it back in at the end.
Could we have a null trait? Like, I'm just going, instead of using null as having meaning, make a null tracer provider and use that's the thing that would get tinkered around with.
That's the API tracer, right?
That's the API tracer provider.
Okay.
Yeah. So we have an API tracer provider, which is the no-op tracer provider, and then we have the default in this implementation, which is a proxy tracer provider, which is an API internal concept and shouldn't be accessed by anybody outside of the API.
This whole testing scenario reminds me of trying to test, say, Sidekick jobs. Sidekick as a library has a testing mode bang, which would put the whole auto behavior into a different mode where you could test that jobs got queued, which smells a little bit like I want to test that spans got sent.
Yeah. I was. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I think I was just going to say the same thing in a bunch of different words. So please.
I was thinking about the testing scenario too, and I think actually if we want to try and make sure users are doing the right things in their testing, ensuring that they are not perhaps recording spans in a memory span recorder all the time and only in certain tests, it would be interesting to have a toggle on the in-memory span recorder for recording or not. And if not recording, just have it throw spans away. And we can tell people in your tests, just set it to the memory span recorder, and at the beginning of your test, turn the recording on, turn it off when it's done. And then, maybe just kind of not have people setting and resetting it as the default idea in tests, and just let them, I mean, I would actually find that useful when I'm like banging around in a Rails console anyways, but
Yeah, we already
in a
have the
test suite.
toggle. We already have the toggle to say clear the buffer.
Right.
So yeah, having something that says whether you're recording or not could be a good idea.
Just a thought.
Yeah. I don't think that's covered. Sorry.
I was just going to say also, another thing about the Sidekick testing thing is you have to explicitly require another file, which is a nice little thing. We could build a bunch of little side testing functionality off in a set of files that are never included when it's running in a non-test mode.
Yeah. The thing I was going to point out was I think the in-memory span exporter is not actually part of the spec. I think it's recommended that you provide a mechanism like that, but the actual API of that is not spec'd. So we do have freedom to add, convenience to that we think makes sense for, testing use cases.
Certainly behavior that we encourage in testing being shunted over into a file that you have to require explicitly would be, if you require this in production, I have a theory about why you're seeing weird behavior. Yes.
Yeah, I do like the idea of having like the in-memory exporter and the ability to have it actually like the kind of recording on or off. Like maybe we give it a more of a glorified title and say it's like the testing exporter that comes with that functionality. And I don't know, I would personally like that as like being able to surface that to like the different teams that might want to test their custom trace points or whatever, and just give them a really one line on, one line off functionality to their test setup so that they can ignore it the rest of the time. That would be ideal, I think.
See building a bunch of sophisticated helper methods around that, like assert span recorded with blah, blah, blah. And like,
Yeah, we have
probably
built
help everything.
all that kind of stuff with our our legacy tracing libraries. So it's useful. Like people find it super useful once they start thinking about how they can use spans in test suites to assert that things happened or things happen in a certain order. So, yeah. Cool.
So I think those all sound like reasonable ideas. It sounds like we still kind of have these questions though. It seems like we can build some test helpers to do whatever we need to do for us. But when we ask the question, should we allow setting the global once? What does that mean to the user? I think Ariel was asking, like, do we warn? Do we throw an exception? Do we just let them do it? Like, do we have any strong feelings here?
I think it's okay to set it multiple times. I kind of agree with Go's implementation here. I think it's okay to set multiple times. I don't think we even really need to warn about it. It seems like a reasonable use case in certain test scenarios, at least. And yeah, I think it's okay to set more than once. I do think that it might be valuable to say you can't set it to nil. And warn in that case. Probably not throw an exception, but just warn there.
Is there so the case is that if it's nil, it's going to get upgraded. Is that, and then people get surprised by the fact that they're suddenly working with a tracer. Hey, I set that to nil, and now I'm upgraded to this behavior that I was unaware
That's
of.
right. Yep.
So maybe it's worth warning when things get upgraded, and then like global tracer's nil, upgrading to, and then if that behavior surprises them, there's a message awaiting them on the console to tell them that something happened.
Yeah.
I say not having looked at this code. So
just
thinking from the user, that would help me.
Yes, we just have to make sure that we're not printing that on expected upgrades.
Why not?
Right. Because it's actually a fairly common use case, and people are already cranky about OpenTelemetry Ruby spitting out a ton of messages.
Maybe it's an output at a debug level, but that means that possibly, we have our own logger to do different logging levels.
Yeah, we could certainly consider doing that.
But I think I am in the camp of like, let people change it, and I think I'm getting the sense that you have to do something kind of weird to get into a case where you're thrashing on replacing your global tracer all the time or having it upgrade.
Yeah, and that weird thing is hammering it to nil. So I would just prohibit hammering it to nil, log in that case, and also probably log when you're doing the upgrade, because it is interesting behavior to expose if people are trying to just like debug through a problem. So yeah, cool.
Thumbs up on those suggestions.
Yep, that gives me some stuff to play around with. I will be a little slow this week because I'm off this week, but I'll try to get to those in the evenings or something. I did want to just take a look at a couple of issues quickly if we've exhausted this.
I think we have. I was mildly curious about the test failures.
Yeah, I haven't looked at them yet, so.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I mean, I took a brief look, and they are failing in the new tests, so we're not like screwing something else up. So it may just be bad tests.
My gut was like maybe like the setup, or maybe things are not getting reset properly, or who knows. It seemed like they passed on some Rubies and not on others, which was even more weird.
Yeah, so maybe the reset behavior is weird, and it's something that we should look into.
Cool. No further questions.
Hammering it to nil might be a problem. Okay, the two things I wanted to look at. One, let's start with 709. I just put these in as placeholders right before the meeting. There's a little bit more meat to them. We are calling time now. Eric actually talked. Is Eric still here? No, he dropped off. So Eric talked about Datadog's implementation of time in their tracer a while back, and we're calling time now and then doing comparisons of timestamps or time objects that are returned. This is allocation heavy. It has some other problems as well. So for our legacy tracer code, we recently replaced this with process clock get time. Clock get time just returns a numeric. In practice, it's a float representing seconds since epoch. And you can specify, which clock you want. Do you want the real-time clock or monotonic clock or whatever? The reason I've so it's a useful efficiency improvement, and it also allows us to treat time properly, which is basically for the start of a span that has either a remote parent or it's a root span. You record the start time as from the real-time clock, but you also record or keep track of the monotonic clock, and then any other timestamps that are part of the same process in the same trace end up being recorded as offsets using the monotonic clock. So this means that you deal with clock changes from NTP or whatever, and you always end up with appropriate duration. So your end times and your event times are always relative to the start time of the first span that was created locally for that trace. So that's the TLDR of kind of what I want to tackle here. The main reason I think it needs to be done before the release candidate is that right now we expose time now as a time representation for all our timestamps in span data and event. And so that impacts exporters. I think if we're doing this, if we're making this change, we should expose those as second since epoch instead. So that's a change that impacts people who write exporters. So any thoughts on this one?
I was going to say thumbs up on using process get time and also on doing it before the RC. No objections here.
Okay. So the other,
One quick question. Sorry. In general, thumbs up on the plan. Just a question of whether the monotonic clock and everything is supported on all the platforms that we care about, whether like Windows or if there are any issues like that.
That's a good question. So I don't know whether it's supported on Windows. I have not programmed on Windows in a very long time. So it is supported on Linux and Mac OS. But yeah, we should check it on Windows. And that, of course, brings up the point that we don't do any CI on Windows or Mac for that matter. But I imagine a few people are running it locally.
I guess that's something I could look into.
Yeah, that'd be awesome if you can. Yeah. Cool. Okay. The other issue was a little bit, so introducing an after fork hook. Process PID is pretty cheap, but we're calling it on every time we record a span. We end up calling process PID just to check. I think we probably call it twice, maybe. But we're checking to see whether the PID has changed, in which case we conclude that we've forked, and we need to do some cleanup work if we discover that we forked. This is in the batch span processor in particular. So we have a change. Somebody at Shopify was doing some profiling, and process PID is cheap, but it did show up on the profile. And so they looked into what to do about it. It turns out, I think the Rails community may have had some investigation of this recently as well. And I don't know what their use case was, but they were looking into this, and they concluded that basically if you try to fork MRI, an MRI process without actually going through MRI's fork code path, all bets were off, and you'd probably crash pretty quickly afterwards anyway. So the suggestion was, cool, yeah, okay, this is exactly the thing. Well done. So yeah, the suggestion is that there should be a callback for forked children, and it's done by, I think, probably monkey patch and kernel fork and process fork. And doing things this way means that you're just running the appropriate code on the path where the fork is happening, as opposed to calling process PID on every span recording.
I don't have any strong feelings about it, other than the purpose of introducing it to cache, sort of, essentially, or to avoid calling process.pid over and over again needlessly, seems valid to me. You know, seems like a very simple little thing we don't have to do. I don't know if it's going to encourage people to do dodgy things after fork, perhaps, but it seems okay to me.
Yeah, so Rails has this, I have not, so this change has been proposed for our legacy tracing library as well. I have not finished reviewing it yet because it is kind of intricate. But yeah, I think once we've tried it out, I'd like to see if we can do the same thing in, it's kind of annoying that we're copying it in a few different projects. But I would like to do the same thing in OpenTelemetry Ruby, because for us, this would end up being a regression once we migrate all our services to use OpenTelemetry Ruby. Yeah, that was it. I don't think at first glance that it actually requires API changes to the SDK or the API. So I don't think it has to gate the release candidate. Cool. That's all I had.
Yeah, that also sounds fine to me. Anybody?
I'm sort of curious about how that core extension would work if we implement it and then you use OpenTelemetry to instrument a Rails app. Are you gonna like end up?
That's a good point, and it's something we should explore, because we are going to be using OpenTelemetry to instrument Rails apps.
Right, so, right. It's kind of the elephant to be instrumented in the room.
Yeah. Yes. So the other possibility, of course, is that we provide a hook that can be called for after fork, and if you're like in the Rails instrumentation, for example, we could hook into the active support after fork hook.
Yeah, we don't want to do this, but it's a shame we can't just require active support.
Yes.
No.
I don't want to do that. Yes.
No,
but
I agree. It's like, I wish, but no.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So we have hit time. I feel like we covered what we wanted to cover. I was just gonna ask quickly if I know there's some things open here. Is there anything that we should be looking at to try to get in? Is stuff kind of stalled for the
So
most
the
part?
two things that have stalled, in my opinion, are the PostgreSQL gem instrumentation. I have not had a chance to get around to reviewing that. And the Bunny instrumentation, I had reviewed that previously, but I need to go back and re-review it since Johannes made the changes that I requested. So I'm not going to be super active this week. It would be enormously helpful if folks who are more familiar with PostgreSQL and Bunny had a chance to review that instrumentation.
Right.
But those are the ones that have been hanging out for a while.
What needs to be done on Postgres?
Basically, just
code.
another set of eyes.
Yeah.
I've been running it in production for the past week, and it's fine. It works, doesn't crash. I can assert that much at least. Seems vaguely useful. So yeah, just reviews. Actually, I think it's otherwise okay to go at this point.
Are there any Bunny or AMQP experts? I feared that. All right. Cool. Well, we'll see what we can do on some of these things this week.
I'll see. I know I said I would look into that, try out the Postgres instrumentation, and I said that like 2 weeks ago when it was open. I'll see if I can set some time this afternoon to wire that up, see how it feels.
Cool.
Bunny, I got nothing, but Postgres, I can do something about.
Awesome, thanks.
Awesome. Right. Well, I guess I will see everybody next week and around online.